So let's say, an old fashioned, typically an old fashioned is garnished with an expressed orange peel. So you spritz a little bit of that orange essential oil onto the top of the drink. That is your top note for an old fashioned. Your middle notes are probably going to come from the spices in your aromatic bitters. So a couple dashes of Angostura or whatever bitters you're using. But especially Angostura has a lot of baking spice notes, a lot of clove, a lot of, kind of those apple pie spices going on. That's going to be your middle notes. And then your base notes are the flavors that are going to linger. So when you take a sip, there's this progression of flavors. And maybe 5-10 seconds after you take the drink, it's like, what is still on the tongue? What can you still perceive? And that tends to be more of those whiskey notes, those barrel notes. So that's going to be where your base notes come from in an old fashioned.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. My guest today has a book and background that is sure to provoke some good thought on behalf of bartenders and enthusiasts. I had the chance to chat with Dr. Kevin Peterson, who has the world-class attitude to go along with his title. He runs Sfumato Fragrances, which is a perfumery by day, and Castalia, a cocktail bar by night. Kevin started in the hospitality industry early in life, but when college came calling, he ended up achieving degrees in both physics and engineering. Of all things that could happen next, he began to amass a collection of rare scent ingredients and delved into the science of olfaction. He then used a lot of his culinary principles to build aromatic impressions, as he calls them, creating the botanical fragrances, cannot speak today, comprising Sfumato's line. Over time, this began to seep into the world of mixology, and now Kevin runs, as I mentioned, Sfumato by day and Castalia, a cocktail bar by night in the city of Detroit. Kevin originally fell on my radar because of his book, Cocktail Theory, a sensory approach to transcendent drinks. In it, he brings the diligence of an engineer and his skills as a perfumer to life in the world of mixology. It's really cool, actually. He is quick to acknowledge that much of his work stands on the backs of people like Dave Arnold, and it's a fascinatingly nerdy read. But what really began to make this book an incredible find for me is a more personal interest that also applies to Kevin. So one of the issues that Kevin feels like he personally faces when it comes to enjoying a good cocktail is that he is a relatively slow drinker. And by nature of being around so much, he points out that within 5 to 7 minutes of being ready, a drink is often dying or dead. And what we mean by that is, depending on the style of drink, a cocktail dies when it reaches an unpleasantly warm or diluted state. The aeration we've injected into it has escaped or that we put into it via carbonation and more. From a food standpoint, I tend to think of this as being offered, a fresh scoop of ice cream versus like melted ice cream. Or someone says, hey, would you like this burger that just came off the grill, or would you like this one that's been sitting on a plate for an hour and a half? Over time, many of the qualities that make food delicious begin to dissipate. So with Kevin kind of identifying that he is a relatively slow drinker, one of the people I make drinks for most often, or perhaps subject to my experiments more than others, is my girlfriend Jen. Hey there, lady. So she, like Kevin, is a slow drinker. So now, to go on the record, I don't need her to drink fast so I can make her another drink or, get her loaded. It's really just realizing that when I shake up something like a margarita for her, she has a couple of sips and then she, is just milling about the house or, we're having this around dinner and she lets it sit on the kitchen for 20 minutes. I'm like eyeing this thing like, hey, this drink is like diluting right now. And so one of the things that Kevin undertook in this drink, amongst so many experiments, was to try to figure out what he could do to extend the ideal life of a drink. So, this book is a crazy and damn near exhaustive journey into his quest to understand the durability of cocktail ratios and longevity. It is a treat to read, and talking with him was honestly a lot of fun. Kevin and I got to meet up in New Orleans this year. You can find Kevin online via his website, which is sfumatofragrances.com. There'll be a link, of course, but Sfumato is Sfumato. There you can find his perfumes as well as a link to Castalia, Castalia. Sfumato is on Instagram at Sfumato Fragrances, and Castalia is at Castalia Cocktails. You can also hound Kevin on Instagram. He is pretty new to the platform, but he is on there at Dr. Kevin Peterson. Again, just waving that doctor title around all the time. You can find everything, including the book, in the show notes, and enjoy this conversation. So Kevin, this book is an incredible opportunity to ask so many questions, but what I wanted to know first is like, how does a person go from being an engineer to a perfumer to owning a cocktail bar? Like, is this like, is this a riddle, or did you own a bet or lose a bet, or what kind of happened here exactly?
Yeah, it's not really the straightest life path. I'll definitely grant you that. Um, in my early life, I jumped around, did a lot of kind of odd jobs, did things here and there, and a lot of those things seemed pretty disconnected at first. So I started out working in kitchens when I was in high school, everything from fast food to bar and grill type stuff, and really enjoyed how flavors come together, and kept doing some odd jobs in kitchens through college actually, and then took a year off of school to go to culinary school just because I wasn't quite sure what academic path I wanted to pursue. I knew I loved food, thought that was really intriguing, and eventually decided that wasn't the path I was going to follow forever. Went back to school, got degrees in physics and engineering, and I thought that that was going to be my path until retirement. So I kind of had this food hobby, had the engineering career, and as I was in engineering grad school, I got into perfumery as a way to kind of keep that flavor part of my brain engaged, but without having to be in a kitchen. I read a book called Jitterbug Perfume, fictional book, but one of the main characters is a perfumer. I was like, oh, this seems intriguing. It seems like there's a lot of parallels between how I think of flavors, how this character thinks of scents. And I kind of thought, yeah, I'll have this flavor fragrance hobby. I'll work my 9 to 5, and that'll be my life. And at some point, those flipped. So my wife and I started doing dinners where we would take some scents that I had composed and pair them to a food dish and a cocktail. And then we'd often pick a music album as well that somehow was inspired by whatever the flavors were, whatever the scents were. So we were doing these multi-sensory dinners, and the person who eventually became my landlord came to one of these dinners and said, that was awesome, you should open a restaurant. When we got into the space that he owned, we realized, okay, the food portion is not going to fit in this space, but if we drop the food, let's do the scents, let's do the drinks. And that's basically how Castalia was born. So we set the shop up to be retail by day. So we sell all the scents, and then there's tables, benches that fold out of the walls, display cases that kind of unfold, and it turns into a cocktail bar at night.
Yeah, quite the trajectory, and it's cool that you were kind of able, yeah, that it's interesting when we look back at life sometimes how we either unintentionally or knowingly, like there are these through lines of like flavor and scent, kind of to your point, following you the whole way. And so that's real cool right there. So to the aroma thing, and I feel like we'll jump around. We might follow a straight line. Who knows with this conversation? Because there's so many things on my mind right here. But I feel like, for a lot of people, the number of experiments you subjected yourself to, and obviously, you pay homage to Dave Arnold and a lot of the other great, cocktail, scientists, experimenters along the way. But one of the things I just found so fascinating, that I feel like will kind of shock the layperson is the idea that if I was to pinch my nose and have a sip of, say, a 40% ABV vodka and a 40% ABV whiskey, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference really. So if I understood that properly, and I meant to subject myself to that experiment, and admittedly, I was thinking about as I was saying this, like I didn't do it yet, so I need to do it. It's 9 a.m. right now, so maybe not right after this. But
Fair.
if that is the case, Kevin, tell us about that because obviously I think, I had a class earlier this week where someone was saying, "Hey, like I can't look at Jack Daniels anymore. I had a bad night and it follows me." And you talk about that a lot with aroma, but talk to us
Sure.
about why a spirit or a cocktail is indistinguishable the minute we take aroma, can be indistinguishable uh after we take aroma out of the equation.
Yeah, I think it's sort of it's a consequence of this bigger idea that flavor is not something that exists in the spirit, in the cocktail, in a food, in a drink. It's something that your brain composes from a bunch of different signals. So if you bite into a grilled cheese, you get some texture based on how hard you have to chew to bite through the grilled cheese. You get some taste from the salt from different taste components interacting with your tongue. You get some aroma going up into your nose, but you experience this as just one flavor. Your brain's taking signals from taste buds, olfactory receptors, um, pain sensors, all these different things, even your visual, auditory inputs come into play, but it's all just meant to create this singular experience. Oh, I'm eating a grilled cheese. Oh, I'm drinking a margarita. Oh, I'm drinking an old fashioned. And it happens so seamlessly that people don't realize there's actually 17, 36, I don't know how you want to count them, but there's a lot of different inputs all coming together to create this singular experience. And you can take those signals apart. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to plug your nose because now no airflow can cross your olfactory receptors. So your taste buds still work, your texture receptors still work, but your olfactory receptors are out of the picture. And minus that signal, your brain paints a very different picture of what that flavor is than when it has the aroma. One of the most classic ways to demonstrate this is called the jelly bean test. So you take, say, a red jelly bean. Okay, red could be cherry, could be strawberry, could be, cinnamon, could be a number of colors. If you plug your nose and bite into it, all you're going to get is the taste input. So you're going to get a little bit of sweet, a little bit of sour, and that's about it. As soon as you unplug your nose, all those aromatic molecules rush through. And this is a test, or this is an experiment I often do when I'm teaching a class. And yeah, I mean, you could have done this at any point, but typically you don't. You don't just sit down to have your, bagel in the morning. You're like, oh, I should plug my nose for the first 10 seconds of biting this just for the experience. Um, so even though it's such a simple experiment, forcing people to do this, and you eat every day, you're like, oh, what is there about eating that I don't know yet? But it's such a profound experience to just have that aroma removed and then restored that, yeah, people's minds are blown. And in the spirit world, a lot of the identification of which spirit category you're in comes from the aroma. If it's 40% ABV, that spirit is mostly, it's 40% alcohol, something like 59% water, a little bit of aroma and color. And that aroma is what's sensed by your nose. When you take that out of the picture, gin, vodka, rum, whiskey all become essentially the same input to the tongue. And that's weird. You're like, how, of course I could tell the difference between them. And yeah, with your nose open, I mean, you could probably look at them and tell at least partially. You could take a whiff of the glass and definitely tell, but oddly, drinking them with your nose plugged, you probably couldn't.
Yeah, and I think one, jelly beans obviously are even a much more forgiving thing. But for somebody's like, if they're not really a spirit sipping type of person, you also kind of draw the same comparison, like, oh, you could also make a lemon drop or a daiquiri and a whiskey sour. And especially if you're
Sure.
using the same proportions. And again, proportions was another thing you did in the book that I want to make sure we get to. But the idea that, yeah, tasting a lemon drop and a whiskey sour side by side, nose plugged, again, is this idea that you're only going to be getting those sweet, sour, salty, et cetera, inputs. The comparison I draw in class sometimes that people are like, oh, like their eyes light up and they get it. But I think it's still just this weird thing to imagine is, oh, when you have a cold, you can't really taste things. People are like, oh, yeah, that's right. But the idea that two things that seem so disparate could be so um could be so universal when you remove certain variables. But yeah, I like this idea that another thing you said too that I feel like immediately to me was another like analogy or metaphor that was helpful was you said you were talking about again like relative levels of how we perceive flavor, and you talked about someone being colorblind, and the idea that like if I can't perceive red and green, like that's just who I am. And for some people, if their taste buds or other receptors are behaving differently, that's where some people might perceive things like bitterness or sourness or whatever in a slightly different level. Am I synthesizing that relatively well? Talk to us a little bit about the color blindness metaphor you drew right there.
Yeah, I think, there's an idea that if I bite into an apple and you bite into an apple and somebody else bites into an apple, we're all experiencing the same thing. And that's not really true. So in terms of color blindness, we have tests to assess this, and it's a little bit of a starker thing where you are colorblind or you're not. In the taste world, it's more of a spectrum where you might be quite sensitive to bitter, I might be not very sensitive to bitter. So and there's a couple different levels. There's a genetic component where I might just have more taste buds, or I might just have more sensitive taste buds. But then there's also this kind of experiential component where, the first time I had espresso, I thought it was terrible. How could anyone drink this bitter garbage? Well, then for whatever reason, I drank it for 15 years and now I love it. So, I've acquired that taste. Um, and so between, both the genetic and the experiential pieces, the way that we experience a flavor is very different from person to person, but we often don't talk about how different that is. I mean, anecdotally, okay, this friend really likes sweet and sour drinks, but this other friend likes more bitter drinks, and this person wants a vodka soda, which is just kind of bubbles and not much else. And we've got these preferences, but you don't often think about how they're driven by potentially this underlying profound difference in what someone is experiencing when they drink a drink.
So this is not in the list of questions I sent you. So pop quiz, Mr. Smart Guy. So one of the things I like to do when I'm teaching in cocktail classes, I like to show the progression of a drink as you add ingredients. And I feel like the easiest drink to do this with for me is honestly is making an old fashioned. And so what I will have people do is combine their Demerara and their whiskey, and I will have them stir that and drink this sugary whiskey mix. And one of the things that
Sure.
always surprises me is how many people like the end up remarking that when they add a dash or two of aromatic bitters, that like, oh, they liked the cocktail better beforehand. Now we are hardwired as humans to like sugar. That's a sign of calories and whatnot. Um, and the old fashioned does not have to be everybody's drink, but I am always shocked by that. Does that surprise you at all, Kevin? Or how do you think about that? Again, some of us are more sensitive to bitter. I am just always shocked at the I can taste the taste difference between an old fashioned with and without bitters, but I am blown away by how many people it becomes almost offensive for at that point.
You're saying when you add the bitters, they get offended by that.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It's so in an evolutionary sense, bitter signals poison. And and here's another thing. I'm sure on an intuitive level, but you maybe not thought about. When you take a bite of something that you don't like, there's a certain face that people make. Their eyes scrunch up, their lips pull back. If it's really bad, maybe their tongue sticks out, kind of blah,
yeah.
yuck.
But it's
They're,
the
they're just like
poison
a yuck
symbol. Yeah,
face. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Mr. Yuck. And um, yeah, that's just an innate response. A lot of things that are poisonous are bitter. And then we've got this innate response, which is basically us spitting out that bitter thing. So yeah, you take a bite of something, your brain says, oh, poison. I should probably not consume this. Let me make the face or let me expel this. And um, it's interesting. I've got an 8-month-old child, and babies and children are much more sensitive to bitter. So if you think back to when you were a kid or when I was a kid, hated green vegetables, anything remotely bitter, I couldn't stand. I've grown to love it over time, but children's bodies are much smaller. They can tolerate much less poison. So there's an idea that they're more sensitive to bitter because it would take less of a poisonous element to do them harm. And yeah, when you're a grown up, then you can sort of work through it and just, you know, the first Negroni I had, I didn't love. I was like, really? I'm paying $10 for this? This was a while ago, back when drinks were
Right.
like $10. But yeah, and then you drink enough just by whatever reason, and it grows on you. So yeah, I think there's this innate response to bitterness that until you become familiar with it, you're just having this natural response to expel the poison.
And I guess I know this, I even talk about this, and again, we talk about aromatic bitters or bitters in general as like is the spice cabinet of the cocktail world, and how French fries before and after being salted are just so different. Um,
Sure.
and so yeah, for a lot of us, the first time we have coffee, or maybe even to this day, or a beer, the first time you had it, you weren't like, oh, I love this. Like it's an acquired taste. And so I always just think it's such a novel experiment, and maybe it's more that I'm just let down that I feel like people go from like, oh, this is interesting to, oh, I don't like this as much. So it's probably just my feelings are being hurt, which is a whole other. This isn't a therapy session, unfortunately. This is a podcast. So one of the things, and I cannot underscore for people who haven't really dug into the cocktail weeds how cool this book is in terms of being able to understand the durability and yeah, like various different preservation techniques. Like Kevin made like I don't know something like I don't know. I'm just gonna guess like 800 daiquiris in the course of all of his experiments for this book. It was crazy,
Sounds about
but
right. Yeah.
so Kevin, you kind of start with this baseline of, again, a lot of time, a daiquiri or a sour spec, for some people can vary a little bit, but you started with like 2 ounces of a dark rum, half ounce of lime juice, half ounce of kind of a 1-to-1 Demerara turbinado syrup to make a
Yep.
daiquiri. And part of what you were doing, you did this across so many categories, was like stress testing this. What happens if I bump the sour, or drop the sweet, or just you did all these different things in terms of, and you began to establish this threshold. And I will include one or two of the visuals from the book where it was like, oh, to your mind, whether it's 2 ounces of booze and a half ounce of each sour ingredient and sweetness, 3/4 of an ounce of each, an ounce of each, you're in this relative safe zone. And often within a 1/4 ounce of that, you're typically going to kind of be in this relative safe zone. But in the course of all those experiments, when you experimented with things like, ratios, temperatures, dilution, and all these different things, and you do this at the end of the chapter, but I guess I'm just curious for the sake of posterity in the recording, how do you begin to summarize what you learn from like your experiments with the sours?
Yeah, yeah. I I found that there were certain ratios among ingredients that seemed to be key. So like with the sour ingredients, or with the sour structure, a spirit, a citrus juice, a sweetener, keeping the same amount of citrus and sweetener was more important than the ratio of citrus sweetener to spirit. So it's like there's this critical ratio of sour to sweet that needs to be maintained for the drink to be delicious. And you can have a little more rum or a little less rum, and that's not quite so sensitive. And what I was thinking a lot about during this is like, how do we appreciate beauty in a cocktail? Or more, maybe more specifically in the taste realm. And if you think about other areas where we appreciate beauty, say visual beauty or musical beauty, a lot of forms of beauty are driven by some kind of ratio. So visually, there's golden ratio and the rule of thirds and symmetries and things like that that make us think an image is beautiful. And in music, everything is fractions. So if you say, I've got this frequency and then let me double it, that's an octave. Or if I take some other fraction, it creates this major chord or this minor chord. Everything is fractions. And I was intrigued to see that the same idea of ratios and proportions showed up in taste, where it's kind of like our brains are hardwired to find these certain relationships, mathematical relationships. And I didn't really want to go so far as to say 6 units of sour plus 6 units of sweet equals beauty. But that was kind of what my data was hinting at. And maybe, yeah, maybe there's a second book where I do a more deep dive into, say, how many grams of citric acid to how many grams of white sugar. I didn't want to quite take it to the laboratory level, but yeah, all my early data basically hinted at this idea that there were certain ideal ratios in the realm of taste. One of the interesting things was the ratio of bitter to sweet for an old fashioned was the same ratio of bitter to sweet that I found in a gin and tonic. So you had a bunch of soda water, you increase the dilution. So there's a different texture, there's a different dilution rate, but that ratio of bitter to sweet stays the same between these two vastly different drinks. And I did not expect that. It's like, okay, you can't think of two more different drinks than those two, but they're tied together by this kind of underlying ratio of bitter to sweet that makes them work.
And so with that, yeah. And so one, everybody go out there, buy the book, use promo code Chris for 0% off. But um when it comes to like the gin and tonic, yeah, were you using a quinine syrup for that? Because I saw that, and so did you have a quinine syrup you were using, and then club soda as well for your gin and tonics? Because I saw that, and I was like, how is he measuring that? Or were you just able to like understand what the sugar ratio was in just the tonic water you were using?
Okay, I totally cheated on the gin and tonic. I actually used, instead of a quinine syrup or instead of a tonic, I mixed turbinado simple with Angostura bitters, which again is not the bitterness that is typically used in a gin and tonic, but I wanted to be able to compare across multiple drinks and sort of keep as many variables constant. So yeah, that was a little sacrifice that I made to sort of eliminate one variable. But yeah, that was something I struggled with, was how do you equate the bitterness from quinine to the bitterness from gentian to the bitterness from cinchona? They all kind of hit different parts of the palate. Some come on quick, some come on a little bit slower. And that was a question that I thought was very interesting and just didn't quite have time to delve into that level in the book.
So one of the things that spoke to me just personally at the top of the book was you mentioned that, hey, we all kind of take these things in at our own pace. But you, Kevin, by just who you are, a very slow drinker. Nothing wrong with that. And I'm not someone who's like going to have five drinks, but like when a drink is placed in front of me, I'm likely going to address the thing not quickly. My friend Jim, shout out to Jim. Jim Wolf's drinks down, and I love him. But uh my girlfriend is a lovely person. She is a relatively slow drinker herself. And so I prepare her a very thoughtful cocktail, and she'll go do chores or kind of sit there eating dinner and not have it. And all I can do is stare at this drink the whole time and be like, this drink is dying right now. And so there are a
Indeed.
handful. So, would you mind talking to us a little bit about, and we can kind of address this in multiple stages, but you did a lot of experiments, and so going back to the daiquiri real quick. So, what I appreciated about the not too dorky sciencey level thing about the old fashioned, the daiquiri, was it wasn't like, to your point, citric acid, but it was like Kevin has these like XY charts and just like smiley face, kind of not frowny face, or frowny face, to like what was his take on this. But Kevin, what are some reasons that a well intended daiquiri or old fashioned, however you want to run with this, dies? It's like I've got my 2 ounces, of my rum, my lime. I've got my lime. I got my turbinado. I give it a good hard shake for 12 seconds. That's in the book, everybody.
Indeed.
Kevin says it doesn't matter how you shake it, but you got to give it a good hard shake for about 12 seconds. But anyways, so once I have a drink, whether that's, and you can talk about this when it's served on rocks or whatever, but what are the reasons that drinks die? And then I'd love to get into some of the things you learned in an attempt to kind of preserve drink life so that you could enjoy a drink at a pace you wanted to.
Yeah. So I think most people, most home bartenders, most professional bartenders, they get the ingredients right. You buy the right rum, you get fresh limes, you make homemade simple syrup. So you've got the right things in the glass, but there are three what I call meta ingredients: temperature, dilution, and aeration. And those are key elements that I would say a lot of bartenders get right. I don't know if they're thinking about these, but they're kind of built into how a drink is shaken or how a drink is stirred. And I find that a lot of home bartenders are not getting them right. They're either not shaking the drink hard enough, they're, maybe not stirring in the right way, something like that. And so those are the things that change in time. Typically, a drink is best either right when it's poured or within the first minute or two, and it doesn't get better. So it's as cold as it's going to be when you pour it. So like, let's say with a daiquiri, if you shake it up, strain out the ice, pour it into a glass, it's as cold as it's going to be. It's only going to get warmer. The dilution is not going to go up because everything that's in the glass is just going to stay in the glass. But then you've shaken a bunch of air bubbles into the drink, and those air bubbles are just going to keep rising at the surface and popping. So you've got the most bubbles that you're going to have right away, and those bubbles are going to go away over the course of a few minutes. So yeah, those first sips are ideal. And yeah, especially at the bar, it's like I shake these up, get them on the tray, ready to bring out to customers. And it's just like, I'm just sweating like, oh man, every second that passes, that drink is just getting a little worse. And my bar is small. So this wasn't what I was thinking of when I designed the bar, but luckily every drink gets to a customer within, typically say a minute or two, just because it's not many steps. It's not very far. There's not many tickets up at any given point. But when you're thinking about how do you prolong the life of a drink, what I found in my experiments was that really no drink is ideal for more than about 5 minutes. And I think this is another fact, kind of like some of those taste or scent experiments we were talking about earlier, where I think everybody knows this kind of on a subliminal level, but a lot of people have not thought about it. And a lot of your opinion is formed on that first sip. So the drink gets set down in front of you, you take a sip. Oh, this is a great daiquiri. Okay. And then you set it back down. And in your mind, it's already been cemented as a great daiquiri. Well, 10, even 20, 30 minutes later, that is not a great daiquiri. It's warm, it's cloying, it's flat, it's gross. Luckily, the first sip was great. So you have it in your mind that it's a great daiquiri. But if it had been served to you in that state that it's in 20 minutes in, you would say, this is a terrible daiquiri. And when you think about prolonging the life of a drink, what you have to do is basically fight those tendencies for the drink to warm up. If it's served with ice, it tends to over dilute and those air bubbles tend to pop. So how do you keep the drink cold? How do you minimize the dilution? How do you keep the air bubbles in there? And yeah, in the book, I went through a very sort of meticulous process to say, okay, I actually went around town drinking old fashions, just going out with friends, and mildly annoying a number of people that I hang out with. But every time I got a drink, I would start a timer and just say, okay, let's just pretend everything's normal, but I just need to know how long it takes me to drink a drink in a normal setting. And I did this for a lot of different drinks, and typically it takes me 15 to 20 minutes to finish a drink. But a lot of these drinks are only ideal for 5 minutes. So that means what, 3/4 of the time I'm drinking this drink, it's in a non-ideal state. That's not good. And not just for me. I mean, I can deal with it, but I run a business where I sell cocktails. It means 3/4 of the time my customers are spending with their drinks are non-ideal. So I was curious, okay, how can I prolong the life? Chilled glasses is a big one. And it's something that I didn't think about at all 6, 7 years ago when I was designing my bar. And it takes a huge amount of cooler space. I honestly, would have to retrofit a lot of things to be able to chill every glass. But if I were to design another bar, that's one of the first things I would do is to say, how can I keep all my glassware cold? When you pour a drink that's maybe 25 or 30 Fahrenheit into a room temperature glass, it instantly jumps, 5, maybe even as much as 10 degrees, depending on how big and heavy that glass is. And that's just lifetime that you just lost. It went away and it's not coming back. I did some more experiments with sort of calibrating the size of the ice cubes I'm using. So this is another one that I think people are going to take issue with. Big ice cubes are not good in terms of drink lifetime. I hate to say it, they're amazing in terms of their visual presentation. I cut my own ice at my bar, Castalia, and a lot of customers, you serve them a drink with a big hand chipped ice cube. Oh, wow, it's so clear. Oh, this is so cool. This is amazing. And visually, it's very impressive. But if you have an ice cube that's, say, 2 by 2 inches cube, by the time that thing melts halfway, you've totally over diluted your cocktail. And what I'm leaning towards in my own drinks is picking just the amount of ice that I need to chill that drink. And even if all the ice melts, the drink won't over dilute. So that's weird because it tends to be more like 1.5, 1 by 1 ice cubes. People say, wait, this is supposed to be an old fashioned. Wait, this is supposed to be a Manhattan. Where's my big ice cube? Well, scientifically, I can show you why this is the better ice to use, but not everybody going out to the bar on Saturday night necessarily wants to be shown a whole series of graphs and talked through, the process of dilution.
I want an Instagram worthy cocktail, not the best cocktail, and that is, to Dave Arnold's, his other partner in crime, Don Lee. We had a conversation at one point, like he's like, this is why Instagram has ruined cocktails in a part because it's more about how it looks, and it is. It feels great to be handed something beautiful.
Yeah.
But it's also like, what comes first, flavor or optics? And not everybody's going to answer that question the same way, right?
Yeah, very true. And this is something I've learned to just bite my tongue and accept. Yeah, I totally get it, but it pains me a little bit. Okay, I've just shaken you this beautiful drink. It's in its optimal state. I set it down in front of you. What's the first thing you do? Take out your phone, set it on the shelf behind you, take about 5 minutes. So yeah, this is a common experience where I'll drop a round of drinks with somebody. Okay, I'll go check on another couple tables. I'll circle back in, 5, 6 minutes. Hey, how's everybody's first couple sips? Oh, we haven't tried them yet. We've just been taking pictures.
And that's when out
Okay,
of your
it's your
back
drink.
pocket, that's when out of your back pocket, you pull a chart and you go, this is why your drink is already dead. Well, actually, it would be dead if I hadn't made it perfectly. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that is the interesting thing. So one of the big things I took away, you had a post in there about something called the everlasting daiquiri was one of your things in there. And yeah, so one of my propositions to the lovely girlfriend is like, yeah, she's getting ready to move houses right now. When you get to the new house, we're gonna pick out your favorite spirit or two, and we're gonna be storing those bottles in the freezer, because
Yeah,
we're gonna chill that booze in advance. Because yeah, to your point, it's like if we've already done a lot of the work to chill a lot of these things down in advance, then the drink will hold its temperature will hold longer.
yeah. And even serving some of these citrus cocktails that aren't typically served with ice, yeah, by chilling the booze, you minimize the initial dilution, which gives you the room to put an ice cube in there to keep the drink cold. So yeah, I won't go through all the details, but just to say there's some nuance there. And if you think about how that temperature dilution and aeration are evolving, you can drastically improve the lifetime of your cocktail to the point that you can finish the last sip while it's still in its ideal state.
Yeah, yeah, no, and so that level of details for the for you guys to go out there and purchase the book. So another thing that I was interested that you kind of broke down in the book too, Kevin, and I had a guy just the other day when I was in a class, he said, "Why is it that so many old fashions that I get when I'm out are bad?" And so first, I mean, I'm like, that is a multi-pronged answer because most people, it's like people are like they're using Angel's Envy, which I mean, they've obviously popped as a company and they're huge now. But like, arguably, even if that's good whiskey, it's like how he told me they made it. I was like, well, that's the problem right there. But all that said, you talked about in the book. So, assuming that we're stirring the drink well, we're getting the ingredients properly, that we are addressing it. You talked about in the book a reason why an old fashioned is a drink that's a bit more on a knife's edge in terms of balancing it than a drink like a Negroni, which I think you even like, hey, you could probably even eyeball this guy right here. So, will you talk to us about like the margin of error and why an old fashioned is more precarious than a drink like a Negroni? Is that possible for you to kind of talk us through a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so when I was an engineer, we talked about like a safety margin. So yeah, it's like how much can you mess this up and it's still going to function properly? Say filling up the tires on your car. Okay, the manufacturer says it's got to be 35 psi. Your car is still going to work fine at 34 psi, 33. There's quite a range of air pressure you can put in your tires, and those tires are still going to work fine. There are certain other things in your car, like say the amount of fuel that gets squirted into your engine. You cannot vary that by 50% in either direction and still have the car work fine. You're going to be spitting out black smoke or misfiring. Like some parts of the car are very forgiving, some parts of the car are not very forgiving. And that's what I had in mind when I was thinking about these drinks is how careful do I have to be in pouring and measuring these ingredients for the drink to still be acceptable? And maybe I'll start the other direction. The Negroni I found was a very forgiving drink. You can mess up the amount of Campari, the amount of gin by almost a factor of two. Oh, I meant to pour an ounce and a half. I accidentally poured 3 ounces. It's probably still drinkable. That's about as it's a very severe pouring error to get that much wrong, but the drink can still tolerate it. Whereas with an old fashioned, it's a very precise ratio. 2 ounces of whiskey to a quarter ounce of simple syrup. I found that if I was off by a quarter ounce, say if I went up to a half ounce of simple syrup, which if you're looking at a jigger, for those of you that have poured a lot of drinks, you know, If you're working quickly in a bar, the lighting's a little bit dim, your hand twitches a little bit as you're pouring. It's pretty easy to get 3/8, half an ounce when you intended to get a quarter. That might be enough to kill the drink. So that's a step where you really have to sort of pause. Okay, double check. Am I at the right level? Whereas with a Negroni, you can say, oops, I overpoured that by quite a bit. Oh, whatever, I'm still just going to dump it in the glass. It's fine. With the old fashioned, that drink might be trash with just a very minor error.
Kevin, at whatever level, just like for the comparison. So, and I think you addressed this in the book and I remember it, but for the sake of the discussion right now. So is it because there are certain ingredients that are in the Negroni that are more forgiving versus the sugar to whiskey ratio is just that more important? Like, what is it about the ingredient in the old fashioned that makes it less forgiving? I don't know if that's a good question, but I'm trying to think, what is it about that balance that makes it so important? Is it something about that the rich level of sweetness in that sugar just can tip the drink that much faster? What is it about that that makes it less durable? And if you don't know, that's fine. Sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I didn't I didn't really speculate about this in the book, but I definitely speculated on my own. I think there's something with the level of complexity where when a drink is more complex, it's easier to gloss over some of the mistakes. So let's say there's just a solo violin player playing some song. Every bad note they hit, you're going to hear it because there's nothing else to think about. You're just hearing that one sequence of notes, and if they squeak some note, it's like painfully apparent. If you've got a whole symphony playing and one person in the back squeaks a note, or this guy's a little bit, he forgot to tune his instrument, quite the right way, you don't notice it because there's just so much else going on that it carries the idea. And I think in a Negroni, gin with all of its botanicals is quite complex. Campari with all of its botanicals is quite complex. Vermouth is just a whole beast I'm just barely starting to even unlock. Whereas with an old fashioned, it's a very simple drink. You know, the old fashioned is more like that solo violin player where it's just a couple notes, whiskey, sugar, bitters, and those mistakes are more apparent in that setting because there's just less to concentrate on.
Yeah, and I guess like so along that line as well, when people are having these like super bone dry martinis as well, I mean the ratio and the temperature is going to be so much more important because again, it's like that has to be hit perfectly, otherwise, it might
Yeah.
not come forward properly. Okay, yeah, that's the idea, and again for people in terms of it's not just being a giant science book or whatever. Kevin has some fun like music and other angles in which he talks about things like aroma and whatnot, which make it like easier to like digest some of these topics. Because he's also quick to point out again, taste, the idea of taste kind of being what you perceive on your tongue and aroma through the nose. Aroma, Kevin's quick to say is much more subjective and it's also much more complex. And so talks about it a lot more through like a musical angle at times, which again, I think helps you better try to understand like this crazy perfuming background. So one other thing I was curious about, for sure, I wanted to get to today. Um, a lot of times, if I see like a traditional well-made daiquiri spec, it'll be often a white rum, lime, and a simple syrup, and they're delicious. And at Castalia, we're going to get some dark rum, some lime, and typically like some turbinado. You
Mm-hmm.
talk about, again, going to the musical reference, that there are like, I forget if it's top, middle, and bass notes. Like again, he's
Yep.
using a musical reference here, but that from like a gin, for example, or vodka, you're going to get these light top notes. I hope I'm capturing that well. And from
Yeah.
certain things, you're going to get mid notes. And I'm curious, and I know some of this is like uh hey, like a well-crafted daiquiri with white rum, lime, and simple syrup is going to be great. I'm curious though, when you think about, because you talk about in your daiquiri, you're kind of tapping these top, middle, and base notes. With this perfuming background, how are you often trying to to reach for all three of those note ranges in every drink if possible? That might be too much of a high-end maxim, but I guess I'm just one of the other things I think would be interesting, especially for just the mixologists out there, is how often are they, if they come to study your musical range, so to speak, right here, being like, oh, can I make a drink more interesting because I'm missing this category of notes? So that's a again a giant question here, but how do you begin to run with that right there?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of a flavor maximalist. So nothing wrong with a lime, white sugar, white rum daiquiri. Totally drank many before, but that's
He's giving me
almost
a
more
funny
like
face right now, everybody. Yeah.
um but that's almost more like that violin solo where it's just kind of this single note. The white rum doesn't have a lot of aroma, the white sugar doesn't have much aroma. Lime is just kind of the star of the show, which is great. Fresh lime is amazing. But what I tend to do is try to really flesh out, or maybe rather the music. Let's say it's like a painting. So the lime is just a little, it's a very nice picture, but it only covers a little bit of the canvas. By adding some deeper, darker flavors with a dark rum, with a Sfumato sugar, maybe you're going to add some tincture in there to sort of boost the aroma as well. You're basically just painting more of that picture and really playing with more of the palette that you have to work with. And I tend to like to fill up the palette. So I mean that's kind of a subjective thing to say, well, I like the violin solos, and it's okay. I like the full symphony. That's a subjective thing, but there's this range that can be played with, and I think considering cocktails in that realm can highlight ways to improve them, to flesh them out more. And there's this whole language in perfumery that you had mentioned, top notes, middle notes, and base notes, that translates very nicely to the cocktail world. Yet I very rarely see it being used in the cocktail world. And so at my bar, every few months we come up with a new menu. And a big part of that menu design is each bartender is designing a couple drinks. We sip them, but then we got to talk about them. And I think that, especially when I got into this world, that was a big struggle for me, was how do you verbalize this nonverbal experience? You take a sip of something, you get an aroma, you get a taste, you get a flavor, you know instantly if you like it or not, if it's interesting or not. But a lot of times it's missing a little something. And I often just struggle to say, like, I just want something more here, but I don't know how to tell you what it is. And when I started taking this perfumery language into my description of cocktails, it made it a lot easier for me to tell my staff what I thought was missing, which not only helped them, but it helped us together find things like, oh, yeah, it feels like something's missing in the middle range. Oh, well, we know we've got these spice tinctures that kind of fill up that middle range. Let's just go grab that. It removes it. It moves it from a trial and error kind of situation where you're like, this drink isn't quite there. Should we try some green chartreuse? Should we try a splash of this? Should we try a dash of that? It lets you be more, it, it gives you more insight into what that drink might need to have more precise language of what that flavor has or what it doesn't have.
Kevin, there's a great list for it in the book, but for a couple examples, just to get people's brains moving, do you mind giving a couple examples of top, middle, and base notes, just so we can kind of like, so when we say one or the other, give us a couple of examples if you don't mind of each, and then they can always look at it, see, find it in the book, of course, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm actually sitting, my perfume desk is right behind me here, and I have my essential oils organized um, by top note, middle note, base note. So in the perfume world, the top notes are typically fruits and flowers. So those are the things that you sense first when you spray a perfume. They're the lightest and brightest. They're the first to fade away when you wear a perfume. Herbs and spices are more of the middle notes. So once the top notes dissipate, the middle notes become more apparent. And then the base notes are heavier woods, resins, roots, things like that. And when you look at the essential oils, the viscosity is often an indicator of whether it's a top note, middle note, base note. If it's a top note, it's very light, very liquid. If you put a drop of it on a piece of paper, it would evaporate very quickly. The base notes tend to be heavier, goopier, almost molasses, honey kind of consistency things. You put a drop on a piece of paper, it's going to be there hours later. And when you try to bring that idea into the cocktail world, so let's say an old fashioned. Typically, an old fashioned is garnished with an expressed orange peel. So you spritz a little bit of that orange essential oil onto the top of the drink. That is your top note for an old fashioned. Your middle notes are probably going to come from the spices in your aromatic bitters. So a couple dashes of Angostura or whatever bitters you're using. But especially Angostura has a lot of baking spice notes, a lot of clove, a lot of, kind of those apple pie spices going on. That's going to be your middle notes. And then your base notes are the flavors that are going to linger. So when you take a sip, there's this progression of flavors. And maybe 5-10 seconds after you take the drink, it's like, what is still on the tongue? What can you still perceive? And that tends to be more of those whiskey notes, those barrel notes. So that's going to be where your base notes come from in an old fashioned.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. And yeah, it was great for me to think about as I, just improve the drinks I'm working with restaurants on and whatnot too. It's like, what is absent from the canon that I would have traditionally leaned upon. So that was great. The only other thing I have, and if there's anything else you want to talk about, let me know. But in the book, I found it was useful because by beginning to break down and think about all those inputs that exist into flavor, it seemed like you kind of like there's a couple of different things that people can be drawn toward or pushed away from. And so it seems like there are questions. Now, knowing as well, you can also help me with this. Well, here, some words we say and people don't readily jump out at. So you ask people about what their feelings are towards bitterness, sourness, and about something kind of being more alcohol forward or whatnot, spirit forward. But you find when someone's like, well, what should I get? You are looking one way or another, and a word like bitter can, especially in America's culture, even though the Negroni and other things are really rising, Aperol's rising in prominence, but some of these words are either confusing or can even be off-putting. But you are kind of really trying to work to understand people's perceptions of these flavor elements, these aromatic elements, before making a drink suggestion for someone. Is that yeah, you think about it?
Yeah. I think that it's a classic problem I've been grappling with is I'm the bartender. I know what all these drinks taste like. I maybe even designed some or all of them. You're the guest. You're trying to find a drink that you're gonna like. Well, I know what the drinks taste like, and you know what you like, but we don't have the other person's knowledge. But we need that other person's knowledge. If I know exactly what you like, okay, I can just pick out of a list of 10 or 20 drinks what the best one's going to be. If you know what they all tasted like, you would just pick your favorite. So this idea of how do you draw that knowledge out of, one person has to draw the knowledge out of the other person. The guest can try to draw the knowledge out of me by reading the menu, by asking me questions. I can try to draw the knowledge out of them by saying, how do you feel about bitter? How do you feel about sour? Using a lot of the language that I think, or using a lot of the language that I use to think about cocktails, but it may not necessarily be the language that the guest uses to think about cocktails. So I often find more specific examples are better, even though I think about bitterness in a very general way. Okay, a Negroni and an old fashioned and a coffee and an IPA and kale are all bitter. But for someone who doesn't work in the flavor realm, they might just think of three of those are gross and two of those are good, but they're not thinking of it bitter as one of the driving elements there. So if I can make it more specific and say, well, have you had Fernet before? Have you tried Campari on its own? that gives me a lot more information than just saying, how do you feel about bitter? Even some of the words, like people don't want a sour cocktail, but they might want one that's bright and refreshing. If they want a bright and refreshing drink, they're probably going to get something with citrus in it, which, in a technical sense, elicits the sour response, excites sour taste buds. But the word sour has a negative connotation. And this is something I've seen on my menus where there are certain drinks where I've described it one way and it's led people, like, it's brought down the wrong path. They saw words that they liked, they ordered the drink, but it wasn't quite the right words, or it didn't quite paint the right picture, and I had to take the drink back. And then there were a few cases where I didn't change the drink at all. I just changed the words I was describing it with. And now all of a sudden everybody loves the drink. And it's just because I was able to paint a more accurate picture with my description. So yeah, it's something I toy with a little bit in the book, but I've, even since the book came out, have been delving into this more, is like, how do you bridge this gap between the nonverbal experience of flavor and the need to describe and talk about flavor with a guest, with a coworker? It's a very intriguing problem, and I think a lot of room for advancement and better cocktail culture if we can dial in our language better.
I agree with that. And I think, yeah, kind of the general sentiments are good for people like, you and me and others to keep in mind. Because, yeah, like a thing I struggle with is like, and I'm sure you've had it on your menus and seen it in other places, like a drink has a super fun name and people just go like, oh, that sounds great. Because beneath it, they see Luxardo, Bitter Bianco, and Genepi, and they don't know what any of that shit is. And so if they don't
No.
ask, they just end up with a drink that is like a bitter punch to the face or whatever, and they were expecting a light, refreshing, sweet and sour drink. And so yeah, I think like you have drinks that don't sell well because they're not marketed properly, and drinks that move that often they might get sent back or set idle because people didn't understand what they were getting in the first place. So yeah, I think there is more. It's complicated. Menus are limited. Guests are unpredictable. But like I think there's more work to be done in terms of, sometimes maybe brands are asking for or paying for their names to be listed on menus and whatnot. But I think there's this whole thing of like, at the end of the day, if the guest is just Russian rouletting on a menu, like it's just, you just never know what's going to happen, especially as the drinks become more complex and we call on all these fringe ingredients that the layperson might have heard of, but probably has no conception outside of a Fernet or a Campari. So.
Yeah, I think describing a drink by its ingredients is one of the worst ways to describe it.
Yes.
Okay, we know
Let
what
that
whiskey
be on
is,
my
we know what
headstone.
this is, right? And a lot of people are single ingredient drink orders. Hey, I'm a tequila person. This drink has tequila in it. Okay. Well, that's, yeah, that might be 80% of the flavor. It might be 5% of the flavor.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, note to everybody else out there. I love you and I'm judging you based on how you write your menus. Kevin, we've covered so much in just an hour, and this is incredible. I really love the book. Is there anything we haven't covered that you hoped to talk about today?
No, I think we hit pretty much everything.
So, Kevin, where can people find you guys online up there in the great Motor City of Detroit? But tell us a little bit, give us the social handles and all that stuff. And yeah.
Yeah, so I have two companies. My bar is Castalia here in Detroit, and the website is castaliacocktails.com. Instagram handle is just at Castalia Cocktails. And then by day, my bar is a perfumery called Sfumato. That's Sfumato. The website is sfumatofragrances.com. Instagram handle is at Sfumato Fragrances.
Awesome. Kevin, thanks so much for this. It's been great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd write us a review on whatever platform you listen on, or share an episode with a friend. The show notes are available at decodingcocktails.com. decoding.com/podcast. Happy cocktailing, everybody.